200 Comanche warriors outside his barn. They were not here by accident. They came for blood, for justice, or for war. And Thaddeus Bear Mallister had less than a day to find out which it would be. Before the drums, before the war paint, before the moonlit circle of riders, there was the sun. The kind of Texas sun that could bleach bones and break men. It baked the earth between Amarillo and nowhere, turning the air into a wavering haze. Bear was out by the creek, mending a busted fence post, the smell of sunburned wood and dust clinging to his skin. At 34, he had seen more than his share of trouble riding herd and working cattle. Yet something about this morning felt wrong. Not just another hot day on the range, but something deeper, like the land itself was holding its breath. That was when he saw her, a small figure, staggering across the far edge of his property. Could not be more than 8, maybe 9. She moved in crooked, faltering lines, like her legs did not belong to her anymore. Her clothes were torn, traditional Comanche garments, frayed and faded from hard use. Even at a distance, Bear could read the story in her steps. Hunger. Most men around here would have gone straight for their rifle. Settlers and the Comanche had been circling each other in suspicion for years. Raids, counter-raids, blood debts on both sides. But Bear was different. Maybe too different for his own good. He set down his tools, lifted his hands where she could see them, and began walking toward her, slow and deliberate. The dry grass whispered under his boots. As he closed the distance, her face sharpened in his view. Dark eyes far too large for her thin face, lips cracked and white from thirst. She looked up at him, and he felt it like a blow, fear and desperation tangled together. She spoke in a rush of Comanche words he could not follow, but the meaning was plain enough. She was starving, had not eaten in days. Her small hands mimed eating, then pointed toward the creek. Bear hesitated. He thought of his neighbors, what they would say if they saw him helping a Comanche child. He thought of the warnings in town about tensions rising, about trouble brewing in the hills. He thought of the smart thing to do, the safe thing. Then he looked into those eyes again and made the choice that would change everything. Without a word, Bear stepped forward and scooped the girl into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, skin and bone wrapped in exhaustion. She did not fight him. She did not have the strength. Inside his modest cabin, he set her down on his one good chair, the wood creaking under her light frame. Bear moved quickly, old habits from years on the trail, pulling leftover stew from the night before off the stove, slicing a piece of fresh bread he had baked that morning. The smell hit the air, and something flickered in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but hope. Bear ladled the stew into a bowl, but halfway to handing it over, he froze. Around her neck, half hidden by torn fabric, hung a necklace, beadwork intricate and unmistakable. He had seen patterns like that before. Just last week, old Pete Morrison had described them in detail, the ceremonial beads of Chief White Bull's family, the most powerful Comanche leader in the region. Bear's pulse kicked hard. If this girl was who he thought she was, then he was not just feeding a hungry child. He was sheltering the daughter of the man who could bring 200 warriors down on his ranch without breaking a sweat. But it was too late to turn back now. The girl was already reaching for the bowl with shaking hands. And Bear was not the kind of man to take food from a starving child. She ate like someone who had fought for every scrap. And somewhere, 20 miles away, a search party had found her trail. Chief White Bull himself riding at its head, his face carved in equal parts grief and fury. By the time the afternoon shadows stretched long over the ranch, Bear's gut was tight with unease. The girl had finished her meal, her small frame curled into the chair, drifting into a sleep so deep it seemed to swallow her whole. Bear stood by the window, staring out across the wide sweep of prairie. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that meant something was moving out there, just not where you could see it. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats. Fast, urgent. Bear stepped out before the riders could reach his door, hoping to keep the girl asleep a little longer. But Cletus Hartwell was already shouting before his horse had even stopped, red-faced and bristling. "Bear! You damn fool! What the hell are you thinking?" Dust swirled around them as two more riders reined in. Deputy Jake Morrison and Reverend Thomas. Morrison's eyes were hard. His words clipped. "Saw smoke signals from the hills. Comanche are looking for something or someone." The deputy's voice dropped, heavy with meaning. "Word from town. White Bull's daughter went missing 3 days ago. Hunting party storm hit. She wandered off." He studied Bear's face like a man looking for a confession. "You would not happen to know anything about that, would you?" Bear's throat felt like sandpaper. He could lie. Should lie. But these men had been his neighbors for years. Whatever else they were here out of real concern. "She is inside," Bear said quietly. "Half-starved. Exhausted. I could not just leave her to die." The words landed like stones in the dust. Reverend Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "Son, do you have any idea what you have done?" "I helped a hungry child," Bear said, though even to his own ears it sounded naive. Cletus paced, raking a hand through his hair. "They are gonna think you took her hell. They probably already think that. White Bulls wiped out whole settlements for less." Morrison was already backing toward his horse. "I have got to report this, but I will give you a head start. Get her back to her people before they find you here." "In the dark?" Bear asked. "She can barely walk, and you expect me to stroll into a Comanche camp without getting filled full of arrows?" "That is your problem now," Morrison said, swinging into the saddle. "If White Bull decides to make an example of you, he might not stop at your ranch." The three of them rode off, dust trailing behind. Bear stood alone in the fading light, the weight of their warning pressing down hard. He thought about saddling up and trying to find the Comanche camp. Thought about loading her into the wagon and heading for town. Every option ended in the same place, face to face with one of the most feared war chiefs in Texas. Then the sound came again. Not hoofbeats this time. Drums. Low, slow, relentless. And getting closer. The war drums grew louder with each passing breath. Slow, methodical, and terrifying in their precision. This was not the chaos of a raiding party. This was the steady march of an army that knew exactly where it was going. The girl stirred in the chair, eyes snapping open. She knew those drums. Her hands moved quickly, pointing to herself, then to the door, then raising her fingers one after another. 10, 20, 30, until Bear counted 200. 200 warriors. More than enough to wipe every ranch in 50 miles off the map. The drums stopped. The silence that followed pressed hard against the walls, as if the air itself was listening. Shapes emerged from the darkness. At first, only shadows, then forms on horseback, war paint glinting in the moonlight. They moved in perfect formation, spreading in a wide semicircle, tightening around the cabin. Weapons in hand, eyes locked on their prey. Then a voice cut through the night. "White man, we know you have taken something that belongs to us. Send out the girl, and perhaps you will live to see morning." Bear's mouth went dry. The authority in that voice could belong to no one else but Chief White Bull. The man settlers spoke of in half-whispers. A leader who had never lost to the cavalry, who had united tribes under one banner, and who now stood somewhere in the dark, watching him. Bear took a step toward the door, but the girl clutched his arm with surprising strength for someone so small. She shook her head and drew her thumb across her throat. It hit him like a bolt of lightning. She was not just the chief's daughter. She was his only daughter. That made her more than family. She was the future of his bloodline. If she returned harmed, even by accident, White Bull would have no choice but to make an example of Bear that no settler would forget. Bear opened the door slowly, hands raised high. The girl followed close behind. What lay outside was a nightmare painted in moonlight. 200 Comanche warriors sat motionless on their horses, a perfect circle around his land. War paint gleamed, feathers swayed in the night wind, and every weapon was pointed at him. At the front sat White Bull himself, massive and imposing, streaks of silver in his black hair, eyes that burned like coals in the dark. The girl ran to him, calling out in Comanche. But instead of joy, the chief's face darkened further. He dismounted, knelt beside her, listening to her rapid words, her hands gesturing back toward Bear. Bear could not understand the language, but he could read the tension in every line of the chief's body. White Bull stood and began walking toward him. The rest of the warriors shifted their weapons in unison, the sound like a field of rattlesnakes ready to strike. "My daughter tells me you fed her," the chief said, his English cold and precise. "She tells me you gave her shelter. And yet, you knew who she was and did not return her to us." Bear's throat tightened. "I was going to take her back in the morning," he said. "She was too weak to travel at night." "Perhaps," White Bull replied. "Or perhaps you thought to keep her, to trade her for cattle, for horses, for safe passage." Around them, 200 pairs of eyes waited for the signal that would turn this conversation into a slaughter. "That is not true," Bear said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I never wanted anything from you. I could not watch a child suffer. If you were Bear, would you throw yourself on the mercy of a war chief who had never spared a white man? Or would you stand your ground, knowing it could mean your death?" Either path was lined with graves. White Bull raised one hand. Every warrior drew back their bowstrings in perfect unison. The sound was like death itself, taking a breath. "You will prove your words," the chief said quietly, "or you will die where you stand." Bear's mind raced. How do you prove goodness to a man who had seen nothing but cruelty from your kind? Then it came to him. "Your daughter was wearing this when I found her," Bear said slowly, reaching into his pocket. Every warrior tensed. But he pulled out a torn piece of cloth, snagged on his fence post when she stumbled through his land. "I kept it because I thought you might want proof that I did not harm her." White Bull took the fabric, his eyes narrowing as recognition flickered. It was from her ceremonial dress, the one she had worn the day she vanished. "She came to my water source," Bear said, his voice gaining strength. "I could have driven her away, could have shot her as a trespasser. Instead, I carried her to my home, gave her my food and my blanket. I asked for nothing, The girl tugged on her father's arm, pointing back toward the cabin. She ran to the door, beckoning for them to follow. Curious, White Bull motioned for Bear to come with him. Inside, she pointed to the chair where she had slept, to the empty bowl on the table. She mimed eating, sleeping, then pointed to Bear and smiled. It was the first smile he had seen from her. But White Bull's gaze shifted to something else. On the table lay a small tintype photograph in a simple wooden frame. A woman and a young boy. Bear's wife and son, both lost to a cholera outbreak 3 years earlier. "You have lost children too," White Bull said, his voice softer than before. "My boy was about her age," Bear replied, his throat tight. "Maybe that is why I could not turn her away." Outside, the warriors still waited, but the air had changed. The girl spoke in Comanche, telling her father every detail of her rescue. White Bull translated. "She says you could have taken advantage. A lone white man with a Comanche child. You could have demanded ransom, could have used her as a shield. Instead, you gave her food and rest." Bear nodded. "I have no quarrel with your people, Chief. I just work my land and try to live in peace." White Bull stood in silence, still holding the photograph. When he spoke again, his words surprised everyone, even his daughter. "My warriors came here expecting a kidnapper. They were ready to burn this place and take your scalp as proof of justice. Instead, we find a man who showed kindness to a child who could have been his enemy." Hope stirred faintly in Bear's chest, but outside the restless movement of 200 warriors was growing. They had come for blood, not stories about kindness. Disappointment in a war party could turn to violence faster than lightning. "But there is still a problem," White Bull said, and the hope in Bear's chest began to crumble. "My warriors cannot return empty-handed. They cannot tell their wives and children that we rode to punish a crime and came back with only words. Some of my young warriors believe that any white man who touches a Comanche child must pay the price. They think I am weak for talking instead of fighting." From outside came a shout in Comanche, and other voices picked it up, louder, angrier. Bear could not understand the words, but the tone was clear. They were calling for blood. White Bull looked Bear directly in the eyes. "There is only one way to satisfy both justice and honor tonight. But it will require something from you that may be harder than dying." A figure stepped forward through the ring of warriors. Broken Arrow, his scarred face twisted with rage. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, voice rising with each word. Bear did not need a translation to know this was a challenge. White Bull's response was quiet but firm. Chief against warrior, authority against grief fed by anger. The girl pressed closer to Bear, and he could feel her trembling. Warriors began to shift, some moving behind Broken Arrow, others staying with their chief. The unity of their arrival was beginning to fracture, and Bear realized he was seeing a split that could tear the tribe apart. Broken Arrow pointed his lance at Bear and shouted something that made several warriors nod in grim agreement. White Bull's jaw tightened. When he spoke, the tone was that of a final warning. But Broken Arrow did not back down. He stepped closer, the tip of his lance almost touching White Bull's chest. The message was clear. Follow the old law of blood for blood, or be seen as weak by the younger warriors. Then the girl did something no one expected. She stepped between the two men, her small frame standing in the gap where steel and blood were seconds from meeting. Her voice rose in rapid, passionate Comanche, sharp, clear, cutting through the tense air like a blade. Broken Arrow's face shifted from rage to confusion. then to something closer to shame. White Bull's voice translated low enough for Bear to hear. She is telling them exactly what happened. How she got lost in the storm. How she wandered for days without food or water. How she thought she would die alone on the prairie until you found her. The girl's voice grew stronger with each word. She pointed to Bear, then to herself, miming eating and sleeping. She was telling the story of her rescue. Even the warriors behind Broken Arrow were listening. Now she is telling them about your family photograph. White Bull continued, about how she saw the sadness in your eyes when you looked at it. She says you helped her because you understood loss, not because you wanted to harm our people. Broken Arrow lowered his lance slightly, but doubt still shadowed his face. He spoke again, this time directly to the girl, and Bear caught one word he recognized. Wasichu, the Comanche word for white man, and not a kind one. The girl's response came fast and fierce. She stepped closer to Broken Arrow, speaking with such fire that several warriors actually stepped back. She is asking him if he has children. White Bull translated, surprise in his tone. She is asking what he would want a stranger to do if his child was dying of hunger in the wilderness. The lance dipped to his side, but the girl was not finished. She turned, addressing all the warriors encircling the cabin. Her voice carried, firm and unshaken. She tells them that judging you for your kindness would make us no better than the soldiers who kill without asking questions first. She says, if we punish mercy, we become the monsters the white man believes us to be. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. 200 warriors sat motionless, weighing the words of an 8-year-old who had just challenged their deepest beliefs about justice and revenge. Finally, Broken Arrow spoke again, his voice low. White Bull translated slowly. He says, perhaps the spirit sent his brother a teacher instead of an enemy. He says maybe wisdom can come from the smallest voices. White Bull looked at Bear with something almost like respect. My daughter has turned a war party into a council meeting, he said. But now comes the hardest part. What is that? Bear asked. Now you must prove to my people that her faith in you is justified. Tonight, in our village, in front of elders who have spent their lives hating your kind. White Bull gestured toward his horse. Are you ready to bet your life on the word of a child? Bear looked down at the girl. Her eyes were still fixed on him, but the fear was gone. This time, she was not asking for help. She was offering it. The ride to the Comanche village took hours. They moved through terrain Bear had never seen. Hidden canyons, narrow trails carved by generations, paths no settler had ever found. Fires glimmered ahead like scattered stars as they approached. Low voices carried on the wind. Word of their arrival was already spreading. The tribal council gathered despite the late hour. 7 elders sat in a semicircle around a central fire. Their faces were carved with deep lines, shadows dancing across their features. Bear stood in the center, fully aware he might be the first white man to enter this space and still have a chance of walking out alive. White Bull spoke first, recounting the events of the last day. How his daughter had been found, fed, and sheltered. Then Broken Arrow stepped forward, his voice sharp, still calling for traditional justice. The debate raged back and forth in Comanche for what felt like hours. Bear could not follow the words, only the gestures in his direction and the shifting expressions on the elders' faces. Then the girl stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but every word carried weight. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, never looking away from the elders. When she finished, the eldest among them, hair white as snow, asked her one question. Her answer came without hesitation. White Bull turned to Bear. He asked if she truly believes you would risk your life to save another Comanche child, knowing the cost. She said yes. The elders conferred in hushed voices, the fire casting their shadows long and wavering on the ground. Bear's heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the next. He knew this was the moment that would decide if he rode back to his ranch alive, or not at all. The white-haired elder stood slowly, his joints stiff with age. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of judgment. White Bull translated. He says the spirits have sent us a test tonight. Not a test of our ability to make war, but of our ability to recognize when mercy deserves mercy in return. Bear felt the weight on his shoulders ease for the first time since the day began. But the elder's gaze was steady, unwavering. You will be granted safe passage back to your land. The translation continued. But more than that, you will be granted the protection of our tribe. Any Comanche who harms you or your property will answer to this council. Bear swallowed hard. I do not know what to say. There is one condition. The elder went on through White Bull's voice. If any of our people come to you in need, hungry, wounded, or lost, you must show them the same kindness you showed this child. I promise, Bear said without hesitation. What happened next caught everyone off guard. The girl ran to Bear and hugged him tight. Her small voice, in broken English, carried clear in the night. Thank you for saving me. Now I save you. As dawn broke over the prairie, Bear rode back to his ranch. Not as a captive, not as a dead man walking, but with an escort of honor instead of a war party. In the years that followed, his ranch became a neutral ground where Comanche and settlers could meet in safety. He never became rich, never sought fame, but he lived with the knowledge that sometimes the smallest acts of mercy can prevent the greatest tragedies. And every year, on the anniversary of that night, a young Comanche woman would visit Bear's ranch. No longer a starving child, but a respected member of her people. They would share a meal and remember the moment when two worlds chose understanding over bloodshed. Bear lived to see 73, passing peacefully in his sleep. Friends from both cultures stood together at his burial, proof that courage is not always about fighting. Sometimes it is about knowing when to feed a hungry child instead.